Okay, so I think the recording has started. Hopefully Carrie will tell me that she sees that. Okay. Okay, good. Good morning, at least morning our time, Debbie. Sorry, want to go backwards? Okay, so today is the second day of the Agile Release Planning. And we're going to talk about the ARP day itself, the Agile Release Planning day itself, which is where I think a bunch of your questions were yesterday on the prior session. Okay, so here's the program. We're going to do a little bit of introduction. We're going to, and most of the session will be about walking you through the day itself and what we're suggesting for that day. Then we'll spend a little bit of time drawing some conclusions about that overall, and then we'll talk about your questions. Okay, so you should have seen ARP part 1, which was yesterday. It's up on YouTube for those of you who may be listening to this later or who weren't here yesterday. It's up on YouTube, and we'll send that out to folks. It'll be also on the website, leanagiletraining.com. And we discussed several key concepts there, which are kind of critical, but we've already discussed them, so we won't review them today, at least not directly. Now we want to talk about, we want to get more practical and talk about what actually happens in the ARP day itself. Sorry, just a second, I've got to let a few people in. I can get my cursor to work. Admit. I think we got everybody. Okay, sorry. So it's a bit more practical, a bit more concrete. And we think to do that well, it needs to be a relatively simple situation. We kind of discussed this last time. So we're looking at one team of 7 people, about 7 people, but at least 7 in my mind. And we're looking at their work for the next 6 months, at least as best we can guess that amount of time at this point. Later on, after having done the day, we'll have a much better guess. But at the beginning of the day, it feels like, we might say, about 6 months worth of work, at least in somebody's opinion we respect. Okay, we want them to be engaged, the people, the team, and the 4 business stakeholders. We want them to be engaged the whole time, contributing, but also learning from one another. And as some of you know quite well, if they're more engaged, they tend to learn better, they tend to retain the information a whole lot better. So being engaged along the way, at least being asked to be engaged, or invited, you might say, to be engaged, is very, very useful. We also have the theory that everybody, each of the people there, all 11, the seven members of the team, the 4 business stakeholders, each person within the 11 has some pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. There might be some negative pieces of the puzzle, things that they think they know that are incorrect. But in one sense or another, everybody has some unique pieces of the puzzle. Nobody understands the whole deal. Similarly, everyone can learn. Okay, so this session itself is going to be pretty fast. We've got a lot to cover in a relatively short time. There are a bunch of slides, so apologies for that. Obviously, we do this in the Agile Release Planning Day regularly and take more time to do it. So if you want more, you can get it there. Also, you can get it from the Agile Release Planning book. But anyway, sorry that it's as fast as it is. Some of us don't have the time or the attention for a longer session, so that's why we're doing it for half an hour. Somebody else just joined. So you might want to make note of your questions along the way. You can certainly ask them to particularly Carrie along the way, particularly if you feel I'm being unclear and you just don't follow me at all. Definitely ask that kind of question along the way. Otherwise, you might want to save your questions to the end on the basis that some of the questions are going to be answered along the way. Okay, whoops. Okay, the Agile Release Planning Day itself is done fairly quickly. Because we only know about roughly, at least on average, half the information that we really need to know, including all the changes in the future. So we can anticipate some of those changes, but in many cases, the changes will surprise us. So net, we have, at least in my theory, roughly half the information we need to have the so-called perfect plan. So therefore, let's only do it in one day. Let's do the initial plan in one day only, which really is about 6 hours of working time after the breaks and so forth. So that's not a lot of time. Some people will complain about that. You'll have to explain it along the way. Do we know everything on day zero? Clearly not. So hence the idea that, as Rihanna puts it, shut up and drive. So let's do it all in one day and then move on and then iterate and change it as we get smarter. So we will revise and improve it as we get smarter every sprint. We're expecting to get smarter enough every sprint to notably change the plan. So we do, and with the knowledge that we have today, we do the best that we can relatively quickly. Now, once we have that, after the end of the day, once we have that, we've got, in a sense, we've got our stupidity prioritized, and then we can work on that. The total knowledge of the group, we've got the relative knowledge and the relative stupidity of the group prioritized, and then we can prioritize our learning, you might say, based on that understanding of what we know and what we don't know. Why do we need to keep it so simple? Or why do we use such a simple situation? To me, as soon as you've got 7 people, it's no longer really simple. So some people feel that it's simple. It's certainly simple compared to a large, safe project where you've got 10 teams or whatever. Having only one team is a lot simpler. But one team of 7 random carbon units is, to me, not that simple. And to me, it should be at least that simple for us to understand it. As you say, as we say there in the third item, the simplicity aids the learning, particularly the first couple of times they do it. So once you've, how should we say, internalized all these ideas after having done them a couple of times and lived through them over that 6 months, then to me, your ability to modify this for a more complex situation will be much more intuitive. You'll do a much better job of it. So we're relying on you to take the learnings and apply them in your situation, which is likely going to be more complex. Okay, so now we're getting into it a little bit. Let's do a little bit of a setup. We're assuming that the manager has given the Scrum team a set of work. The team is about 7 people. It's about 6 months worth of work. We said that before. We have the 7 people. We have of the team. We have the 4 business stakeholders. We have, so to speak, organized the day, or someone has. They've set up the day, the conference room, invited the people, and that's about 3 days after we got the information, and that we can get everyone co-located. Some of you will be challenged by that, I'm sure. But we really recommend that if you're going to co-locate the team, and you really have to, this is the day that you really must co-locate the team, in my opinion. Anyway, and that's a whole different situation or a whole different problem. We won't go into that in great depth, but we're strongly recommending co-location. Okay, so at the bottom you're seeing the steering committee of the 7 people has all the ideas. They've been prioritized. They've given us, we're team A, they've given us project 1, the most important project in the division, in the company, or at least in this area of the company. And we, team A, are going to then do the Agile Release Planning day and then, so to speak, figure it out ourselves. As I said yesterday, when they give it to us, they typically give us their idea, the steering committee's idea of the scope, the date, and the budget. One would think, or at least hope, that they would be giving us a range, and one would hope that they're expecting feedback and they're expecting our answers as a team with the business stakeholders to be different. But that won't always be the case. But at least they've given it to us. They've given us some information, maybe in a meeting, maybe in a 1-pager, maybe even a 20-page BRD. But we do the usual thing, which is we kind of pay attention and we kind of ignore it and we do the right thing. At least that's what I think usually happens. Okay, so the first thing we do is we create the vision together, all 11 of us. And it's not dictated to us by the product owner, but rather we all contribute in creating the vision. And in fact, I wouldn't give the pen to the product owner. I'd give it to the person who's least informed and force the product owner to talk more. Anyway, we do it all in one flip chart sheet in about 20 minutes. It's rather abstract. It's typically somewhat understood, but not very well understood at this point. But at least we've got a common vision that we all go, okay, that's what we're trying to accomplish. So to speak, that's our North Star. And everyone participates, or at least everyone is invited to participate in building the vision. Okay, now we work on the product backlog. So a bunch of these in a row will be product backlog 1, and then the next slide will be product backlog 2, as you see. So these are paired up. Okay, the first part of product backlog is we identify the roles. In this case, we mean the personas, the actors of the people that will be using the product that we're going to build, whatever kind of product, software or non-software. And I'm kind of recommending, it's not a strong recommendation, but about 5 to 7 different personas, actors, end-user types, you might say. So these are the roles that will be used in the user story format that some of you are probably quite familiar with, maybe all of you. These are obviously not the roles in the team per se, unless the team is the key user of the product, I guess. Not a very frequent occurrence, but it does happen very rarely. And I recommend taking about 10 minutes to identify these roles. You may identify additional roles later. You certainly want to flesh out or put more meat on the bones, so to speak, of these roles, either earlier or later. But we can at least list them in 10 minutes and discuss them briefly in 10 minutes. Okay, having the roles, we can now then build the product backlog. So we're going to start to create the product backlog together. Everyone gets the stickies, everyone gets a pen, everyone participates, or at least can participate. And I at least strongly recommend that they use the user story format, the 3 parts, as the who, the what, and the why. As a role blank, I can do blank so that blank, blah, 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 blah. So the user story format, and we build about 50 stories for the 6 months. So the 50 stories should, at least in our minds, cover the full 6 months of work. Okay, how did I get to 50 stories? 12 sprints times 8 stories, which is what I think we're going to need later eventually when we actually do the sprints. So 12 times 8 is 96. I basically take half of that, which is roughly 50 stories, and say, let's build 50 stories today. So all the stories, from my point of view, are, on average, at least small epics. In any case, we can build 50 stories. We do. Some of them are too small, some of them are too big, but a lot of them are pretty much in the right range. And the very first time they do this, it doesn't totally suck. They're useful stories, which is really quite impressive when you think about it. Anyway, it takes them about 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes to create those user stories. They could create it a lot faster, but they don't. They talk, they waste time, they don't shut up and drive. But after about 30 minutes, 45 minutes, if you are a good Scrum Master and manage the time boxes, they've got 50 or more stories done. And so to speak, you can put a fork in it. They're done. They usually don't have a lot more to say at that point. Okay, now we take those stories, we start to discuss business value. The first thing I recommend is we discuss the drivers of business value overall, the drivers for the project. So they basically are describing to us, or telling us in numerical form, why are we doing the project? So they are metrics, they are KPIs, key performance or process indicators. So with these drivers, we could prove, or at least we hope we could prove later, that we hit the bullseye. We did what was really needed for the customer or for the company. That's what we would hope would happen with these metrics. In practice, what usually happens is we prove to ourselves that we didn't hit the bullseye, we didn't even hit the target, but we at least can learn from having the metrics. But the key point right now is it clarifies in people's minds, what is it we're really trying to accomplish? And it's funny, but it's kind of true that this makes it much more real for people when they see the metrics, as comparing that to the nice words of the vision statement that we did earlier. So it gives us an idea where we were heading with this project, with this product, or whatever, this work that we're trying to do. Okay, having those ideas in mind, we can then do the priority poker. We get the 5 best people to do the priority poker. So those 5 best people would be the 4 business stakeholders and the product owner, at least in my opinion. And then we give them the Fibonacci cards, and they then first identify the biggest business value card, the one, and then they arbitrarily give that 100 business value points. And then they vote, as 5 of them, getting close, averaging their votes. They vote on all the other stories. And the implementers watch and learn and understand better why we're doing this project. So we compare all the cards to the reference story, and then all that voting and learning should take about an hour. 50 stories, 60 minutes, maybe 75 minutes if they need to go a little bit slower. Remind them, you'll have to remind them that they don't know everything today. They're going to learn more later. This is only the first time we're doing the business value points. When they know more, they can vote on the business value points again. So just give their best guess, you might say, their best intuitive feel for what the business value points are today. And then some of them later, they'll look at it and go, not so happy with those numbers, and they can go investigate, learn about those particular situations, and then revote the business value points later. So we got to, as we say, shut up and drive as we're doing this, at least with some of these guys. Okay, now we talk about the effort. So we've got 2 slides on the effort. The first thing is we review the definition of done. The DoD, or why are we doing this? The DoD identifies the effort that happens in the sprint, and that's the effort that we're going to be estimating with the story points, which is what we're going to do next. So this helps the estimators estimate more consistently, or maybe you may just say better. Okay, then we get the right people to start to do the effort estimation, that is to say, the implementers. But before we do that, we have to have a reference story. So we have the Scrum Master and an outside expert, not one of the implementers, not one of the doers. The 2 of them argue about it and identify a small story. Typically, we recommend about 1 ideal day of work, in their opinion, for that team. So they identify that as the reference story. They put a 1 story point on it. It represents 1 story point, not 1 ideal day. They do not explain all these details to the team, to the implementers. Then we give the implementers the Fibonacci cards, the planning poker cards, and then they do the planning poker. They do the estimation, comparing everything else to the reference story. And everyone is voting for the full effort, not just their own personal effort as a coder or a tester or whatever role they have, but for the full effort for the team in comparison to the reference story. So a 2 would be twice as much effort, although they don't know what the 1 really is in terms of effort, although they can tell it's small. A 2, if they vote 2, would, or if it averages to 2, the 2 would mean twice as much effort as the 1. Again, this takes about an hour, maybe 75 minutes in total. Again, they're going to have questions, and we have to make assumptions. They're going to be, some of them are going to be concerned, we're going too fast. Remind them, we don't know everything today, we're going to learn more later, we're trying to find out what we know and what we don't know. It's okay if some of them are pretty much swags, as we say, strictly scientific, wild donkey guesses. So we're doing the best we can in a time box with the estimation. Okay, now we have 2 numbers. We can calculate the R factor, which is the business value points on 1 story divided by the story points on that same story. So they calculate that pretty quickly. What does it represent? It represents the ROI of each story. We might call it the bang for the buck, the cost-benefit analysis. We might say, and people do say, that we are identifying the low-hanging fruit. How long does that take? About 4 minutes to do the calculation. Then we sort it by the R factor. We sort the whole product backlog, all 50 stories-ish, whatever number of stories we have at this point. By the way, as we did the story points, as we did the business value, we will inevitably identify duplicate stories. So they can be taken out. So we might have started with, say, 55 stories. We might have 48 stories at this point. In any case, it takes for about 50 stories, it takes about 4 minutes for the team to organize that from high to low in terms of R. Everyone participates. So now we've got it in that order. Okay, now we can reflect a little bit. The product backlog will not look right. People will say things are not quite in the right order, particularly from what they're used to, which was typically mainly based on dependencies. So they will see that it needs to change. But in some ways, it's making sense. We want to do the most important stuff first. And typically, ROI is what makes something the most important. Not the only thing, but it's typically the most important thing in terms of why we do it first. Okay, now we have to reorder the product backlog based on some other factors. What I propose is we consider these things, although I'm not too concerned what you consider. Usually your team will consider the right things, whatever words they put to those things. But anyway, risks, both business and technology risks, dependencies, both business and technology. One they often forget is learning. We should try to learn certain things earlier that will benefit us, make our project more successful, make our product more successful if we learn certain things earlier. So we really recommend doing certain work earlier so that we can make that learning happen, so to speak. The minimum marketable feature set, the minimum viable product, because of those considerations, certain things that are maybe of low ROI will need to be done earlier and included in the MVP. So we'll reorder things based on that, and maybe some other factors that are specific to your situation. How long does it take to do that? It seems to vary a lot, but not that much, somewhere between 5 and 30 minutes. So here's, on the next slide, how we recommend doing that. Anyone can propose, anyone in that group of 11 can propose moving something forward or backward, but usually forward is what they want to propose. That person that proposes that must explain why that story needs to be usually earlier. Anyone in that group can disagree and say, I don't understand the logic, doesn't make sense to me, I think you should move it more, I think you should move it less, whatever. Anyone can disagree or argue about it. A discussion at least often ensues about that particular story. If there's not no agreement relatively quickly, then the product owner must decide, at least for now, and move the story or not move the story as much or as little as the product owner wants. This is to suggest that the product owner and the team can revisit this whole issue later as they learn more. Okay, now we're ready. We have an organized product backlog based on, so to speak, everything, the ROI and all those other factors. The product owner then, with consultation by anyone in the team, but the product owner has to draw the line, or draw the lines, as I say, for the first 2 releases. Usually first 2 releases. It might be more, it might be only the first release, but I'm kind of recommending 2 releases. And suddenly it becomes clear which stories are making it in the first release, at least our first guess about that. Now, once we've done that, we're expecting those guesses about what's in, what's out of the first release, what's in, what's out of the second release. We're expecting those guesses to change. So this is only the first guess. Nobody's taking it too seriously, but it's starting to make things real for everybody. So we're kind of at the line at the bottom here of this slide, or excuse me, over the right-hand side. You see the product backlog. I think you can see the cursor. You see the line for release 1, which implies those stories, 3 little lines, but usually multiple, quite a few stories, are in the first release, and then the 3 little lines, but representing really a lot more stories, are in the second release, and so forth. And then there are things that didn't make the cut, so to speak. So we're putting those lines in there. I got to do this. Okay, so now somebody's going to say, well, okay, how long before the first release is going to get done? And to be fair, it's going to be a swag, but we can start to do a swag about how long is it going to take, how many sprints is it going to take to do the first release. So we estimate the velocity of the team per sprint, at least our average sense of the velocity. That's a fancy calculation. We're not going to go into that here, but not that fancy, but it's somewhat of a fancy calculation. But we take a guess at that. It's a swag. It's a calculation, but it's still a swag. Then we use that to estimate how many sprints it'll take to complete the first release. And we want to include at this point both the contingency and what I call the landing strip. So I think that's on the next slide. So you see here that we've got, let's see, I can't see it because of the way things are organized here. We've got 30 stories. We're going to, as a very simple example, assume that each one is 4 story points. So 30 times 4 is 120 story points overall in the first release that we've identified, of identified stories. We're going to assume very, very simplistically that the velocity over all the sprints is 20 story points. So if we divide the 20 into the 120, we get 6 sprints of identified work. So I then call that, I draw a line after those 6 sprints and say we're feature complete prime. That is to say, if everything went according to plan, everything would be built, tested, all the bugs fixed, the code would be clean because we would have refactored the code along the way. It would be quite wonderful, except that we know things will never go according to plan. So we need to have contingency. And here, in this case, I'm recommending 2 sprints. We'll talk about that a bit more, contingency, a bit more later. And then we need to add, in this example at least, 2 more sprints for what I call landing strip. The final, well, most of it's the final testing and fixing of bugs. So we're doing a fuller integration regression test, a UAT, maybe some other tests as you see listed there. Maybe some training happens in that time slot. And we've got 6 plus 2 plus 2, in this example, 10 sprints for the first release. So in this manner, using this approach, we can guess at how long is it going to take to deliver the first release. Okay, now we can do the budget. We can take our first guess at the budget, you might say. So we find out what the cost per sprint is. In this example, for now, we're going to assume 40,000 per sprint is the total cost per sprint, mainly the people cost, almost the people cost plus some reasonable overheads. In our example, we said 10 sprints. So in a very simple calculation, and there may be some additional things to add, but in a very simple calculation, 40K times 10 sprints is a budget for the first release of $400,000. So now we have to sort of finish things up and discuss the contingency, which we would have actually discussed a little bit earlier. Talk about how we're going to communicate the plan changes to the right people, and then talk about the fix-it plan. Okay, so the contingency we need to consider when we considered those two sprints, or decided on the two sprints, we had to consider that life sometimes, usually always, steals people from us that we expected we would have. And while we may get other people, that's usually we end up with less people time than we thought we would have. We never have all the stories up front. The stories that we do have up front are typically underestimated. At least that's what always happened with Waterfall. And the famous stuff hits the famous golden fans. So for those 4 reasons, at least I call it 4, we have to have contingency. And usually what we ask for is not enough, as you know from experience. Then we need to communicate continually and start talking about how are we going to communicate continually the changes to the plan, all the different things that cause changes. So we're going to, in this communicating, we're going to be, in effect, educating both the managers and the customers so that they become comfortable with the changes. So we're talking about how we're going to do that, how we're going to make that communication happen or that education be effective. And to me, the key result is that the managers sing that famous song by Queen. I think the lyrics in the Queen song are "We are the champions," but they're singing it to us, so you are the champions. They say. So they see that we're, despite all the problems of life, we've been, everything considered, quite successful. And I think almost always, more than 80% of the time, that's the case. So that communication is quite important. The fix-it plan. So here we want to identify the few things that we can do in the next couple of days before sprint 1 starts. So in my example here, the ARP ends on Thursday at 5 p.m. We've got Friday, we've got Monday, we've got Tuesday. Then finally the first sprint starts with the sprint planning meeting at 9 a.m. on Wednesday. So we've got 3 business days, and maybe a weekend, but really the 3 business days to do several things. In my example here, things that we might do could be we chase up on the curious case of the missing stories. We select 5 or 10 stories where the business value points suck. We select 5 or 10 stories where the story points suck, and we learn something about business value, story points, or missing stories, and therefore can change those things, can create missing stories, create new stories that were missing before, and revote the business value points and revote the story points. So that's what the fix plan would be about. It wouldn't necessarily always be 3 items, but those are 3 common items that might be on the so-called fix-it plan. You could think of it as a to-do list for those 3 days. Usually we don't have much time. So to do those 3 things is often itself just plenty to do. Okay, so we must mention that we're going to be continuously improving this thing. So the main way we're doing that is what I call release plan refactoring, but the community calls it grooming and refinement. We're recommending 2 meetings per sprint. Again, we're assuming, not sure that I said this before, but we're assuming a 2-week sprint. In the meetings and during the sprint, the team and the business stakeholders are learning things that force the plan to change. But not only they, also the product owner is working with other people outside the team that are maybe doing research or other things, or maybe just bringing changes to us because, and we then have to take that information and put it into the grooming refinement, Joe calls it refactoring process. So these changes can be good, bad, or both. Okay, so what are the keys? We prioritize our stupidity. We improve the plan as we get smarter. And we're always actively trying to get smarter with 7 or you might say 11 of us. Can things get worse? Sure, they can. They always have with our projects. It's going to be later. We're going to have fewer features. It's going to cost more money. So that certainly can happen. It's still going to happen in Agile. But can things get better? So can we identify fewer features that are essential in the next release and therefore release it sooner? Or in some other way, fewer story points in total at least? Can we identify a better direction than the initial direction, or just better features within the initial direction, the initial vision, you might say? The velocity can go up. We can fix other impediments that somehow improve something other than velocity, let's say. So, for example, the quality could go higher. In these ways, things can, if we use the planning effectively, and from other reasons as well, but if we use the plan effectively, these things can get better. Okay, so what are our goals for the ARP day itself? One of the key goals was we wanted all the people, all 11 people, to be on the same page. Specifically, I say that we can break it down into 3 things. We want them to see the same elephant. We want them to be more motivated. We want them to share the key tacit knowledge. And I think the sharing of the tacit knowledge, particularly through doing the numbers of the business value points and the story points, sharing that tacit knowledge, the knowledge that they often don't even know that they know, that's, so to speak, in the back of their heads, and getting that out of their brains and into the brains of the rest of the people, that sharing of the tacit knowledge is quite big and quite important. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. Then your questions. So add your questions here. Pretty fast, I know. Hopefully you took a couple of notes along the way of what your questions were. I guess okay, sorry, we'll miss you, Neil. Okay, Sean. Would you all, so a question from me to you then, would you all like to have another session to talk about Agile Release Planning more broadly? At least I can share my ideas. Maybe we could share across from one person to another within the group. Would that be of interest? Rafi says, who are the stakeholders? Very good question, and hard to be. It can vary a lot depending on the nature of your product. But to me, they are people that can represent the customers well, and they can represent the business side well, the organization well. And for example, they can give feedback, good feedback, useful feedback every sprint about the features that have been built. Or at least they can be the decision makers about the feedback and allow some of their other folks, their SMEs, the business analysts, whomever, to give more specific, detailed feedback. But they're key people who can represent the customers well and the business side well. So often they're somewhat senior, and they may be, if you're the Scrum Master in this meeting or this day, it may be difficult to manage them and, so to speak, herd the cats. Does that give at least a little bit of an idea, Rafi? Exactly their titles, exactly how to describe them can vary a lot depending on your company and your product and your situation. Okay, Rafi says it helps some. How can we plan for longer term things? Okay. So you mentioned bank loans. So to me, having a budget, having an initial budget, including contingency, gives you an idea of the total investment, you might say, in this product, in this project, at least for those 6 months. You could do that. You might not feel comfortable enough in one day that you've got a good enough answer, but at least you've set the stage that in maybe another 2 weeks, it's close enough, and then you can use that to go get a bank loan. In a similar way, you may look at it and say, well, we don't have enough built as fast as we'd like. We need to have another team. That may tell you need to hire new employees. Be careful, though. Often it takes a while, particularly in this marketplace, to hire the new employees. But you may, in a little bit different way, you may see after you've done this work, and you should reflect on this as a team, as a group. Do we have, now that we know the work a whole lot better after this one day, do we have the right people in the team? And often you will discover that that we need to maybe take one person out and maybe add a different kind of person with a different set of skills or whatever. You may decide or see that you may need to make some people changes. Does that help? I think the scope has to. It's not me that wants the scope to be flexible. It's the nature of life that the scope has to be flexible. We never know everything on day one, no matter what we do. I guess there's a longer discussion about that, Rafi, but to me, it's not that we're trying to make it flexible. It's that the nature of the situation means that to some degree or another, maybe sometimes more flexible, sometimes less, but depending on the situation, it will be flexible. The situation may decide or may tell you it ends up being more or less flexible than the average situation. Hope that helps a little bit. Your question about flexibility leads to a longer discussion that we don't have time for here today, I think. So sorry for a partial answer. Other questions? Okay, let me just wrap it up. If you have a question, you can still ask it. But we will take the recording. I think we've got a good recording. We've already uploaded the first one to YouTube. I'm not sure we've sent it back to you or sent a link back to you, but we'll upload this recording to YouTube. We will also, in a similar way, make a PDF of the slide deck and make that available to you and send you a link for that. And for those of you that are new, we will send to both the group yesterday and the group today a link to download our book on Agile Release Planning. So hopefully those things are useful to you. Debbie has a question to confirm. Yes, well, my example, Debbie, was for only one team. If you add 2 teams, for example, or maybe 3, it becomes more complex. So what I would strongly recommend to learn how to be Agile is to do it in a simple case, that is to say with one team. Once you feel like you've done that a couple of times, you're pretty good at that as a group. Both you and the group, the business stakeholders, the team, are good at that. Then think about making it more complex. So I would do this first a couple of times before I try to do something in a safe or scaled Scrum kind of environment. So yes, all I was talking about today was a one-team version. You could, I guess I will say, you could do something like this with multiple teams, and that's a very interesting discussion, exactly how you would modify it to do it for multiple teams. Okay, it's a bit over time, so I guess we'll close off now. Thanks so much, enjoyed it. Hope you did. Please give us some feedback. I think you'll see something from Mary seeking your feedback. So hope to hear from you later. We'll be doing another one of these. We certainly would like to have your ideas, what similar kinds of webinars could we do. We'll be doing another one of these certainly by sometime in February. Thanks so much. Have a good day.